This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And it's uh, November the 8th, and we're repeating our Sunday program because it was a little muffled. So we're trying to repeat that. We've been talking about planning. We've talked about people having an idea and getting together two or three other people. At the other end of this, there's a high organization. You're seeing it at the national level at the present time. It needs a huge organization, but we do have some of that sort of thing at the local level. I have two examples locally so that you don't get to think that you can't contribute. We have a regional planning office, and we have a QOTS, which is a Champaign County Urban Area Transportation Study Group. And that brings together people from the administrative part of the community. It is at the mayoral level, the engineering level, at the planning level, and also at the community level. So there's several offices here. The sort of plan that you might look at is one that they've been handling to get a continuation of a trail that finishes on 150 and needs to get into Urbana. Part of the problem is that when a railroad yard closes out, it usually keeps a 1 mile track to park trains. It's convenient to take a train through the yards, and then the train has access for various parts of its manifest to go on to sidings. So you have an alternative of going through the railroad yards, and that we'll think about. Another example is where the community at large was thinking to have a road to the south of Champaign and Urbana that would be more or less a ring road. Many communities, when expressways were going in, tried to avoid going through the city. Some people wanted to go through the city, so they actually have heavy traffic going through the city, but not stopping. That doesn't necessarily upgrade your sales potential by having semi-trailers go through the main street. So that particular project was to have a ring road south of Champaign. So two of those projects I'll work with just to give you an idea that you can participate in this paradigm of planning. There's another thought too that this is Champaign County, and we're dealing in the case of the railroad trail. We're dealing with several counties, and so there needs to be East Central Illinois Planning Commission, but it doesn't really exist. And there's some tacit opposition to having something like that because most people in rural communities do not want to be told by planners what they should be doing. And so If there is a big problem like a landfill that is on top of an aquifer, which is providing water for uh, 8 or 12 communities, then there's a reason for getting those uh, groups together and working at the state and federal level. But that is a particular problem that is handled at the time. And usually that doesn't mean that there's a permanent East Central Illinois Regional Planning Office. So back to Champaign County, let's look at the railroad situation, which we've talked about enough that you're not totally out of the situation. Let's explain it a little bit. There was a Conrail abandonment between Abandon and Danville. Danville has the same problem that Abandon has. There's a 1 mile backup that is kept for freight trains that are usually about a mile long. Sometimes they're getting to be longer than that, but it's enough to back a train up and store it for a while. So you come to you running parallel to 150. 150, the roads came in after the rails, and they usually parallel the rails. Well, this acquisition was made by the federal government. There was a concern that we were taking out too many rails, and we would like to store this railroad track. So there was a creation of a rail banking act, which meant that the railroaders would take advantage of people who wanted hike and bike and biology corridors and were buying these lines. So the railroad people realized that they were, if they wanted to put back a railroad in 100 years' time, because Danville perhaps had developed an industrial site that needed to get out access to Canadian National and Champaign, then they, if they were trying to recreate that corridor, that right-of-way, it would be very expensive to do, and there would be a lot of royal opposition. Better to work with the hikers, bikers, and biologists and give them money to develop a bicycle trail called an interim trail use. So that interim trail use acquired working with Conrail and Surface Transportation Board and the local institutions that were making the move. In that case, it was Heartland Pathways. We initiated the move. Then you have to think about how we get into both ends of this corridor so that people don't stop 1 mile out of town. So you have to think about the roads that might be possible, and often they're minor roads, and you have to consider safety. So go to the Urbana end, and you've got the rail trails stopping 1 mile out of town. It's a place called Dobson Drive, and it's about, I would guess, about 400 feet from a little road. So somebody got active and wanted to join 150, which is on the north side of the railroad bed, to Main Street, which is on the south side. And there are houses along Main Street. So they negotiated with the railroad company to cut that 1 mile in two. So there's Smith Road that cuts off a little bit of 400 feet of railroad right away where normally a train could park. So we have a terminus on the rail trail, which connects with a little piece of still owned by Norfolk Southern, who owned what was Conrail. Now, if you are going to look at that, you have to have organizations that can study it. And one of those is the Regional Planning Office, which is often given the task of looking into these situations and creating a plan. But there's also QOTS that brings a number of agencies together. First of all, you have to figure out a region. If this is Champaign County urban area transportation study. So what does that mean? Somebody has to dream up Champaign-Urbana. That's fairly natural, but do you include Savoy? Do you include Rantoul? Do you include Mahomet? Well, in this case, it was decided that it would include Savoy, Mahomet, and Champaign-Urbana, and that was about it. That leaves out some of the areas around about. But that's part of the limitation. And this group of people, probably about 10 or 15 people, including the engineers and the mayors and the planners and the safety people, meet fairly regularly. And in the long run, they'll make a vote on what they want to do. So what the regional planning does as a service unit is put together some of the information. First of all, how many people, how many groups might be involved? Well, first of all, you have to have a name. You have to have something so that you can get this up on the computer, so that you can talk to people, so that there's a name and it has an acronym. And if it's ABC, that's the acronym. So then you have to know who is the leader of the push, who suggested this, so there might be one person or one agency that's been involved. That's listed. Then there are the associates. Then there is a question of who can fund what. If there's a park district or a forest preserve or other agency, and they have to be listed. So regional planning is making a spreadsheet of all this sort of information. And you have to know that this is federal money or this is state money and what proportions. If there are 10 different groups involved, what can they do? There are subunits. For instance, the park district might offer to put in a headquarters to this rail trail at Weaver Park. And so their responsibility will be to look at the park, look at the prairie that they have planted, but look at the trees that have been there for a long time and are part of what was a big grove at one stage. So there's history involved as well as planning. and they might be able to have their own board uh, through their representative to say we're prepared to put in, say, $2 million or whatever it is to facilitate a uh, trail headquarters. That's just one of the alternatives that are being offered, QOTs. Another one that we like to think about is goes beyond getting into Urbana as a city, but going around Urbana so that you can go through Champaign-Urbana and get to Bonneville, Seymour, Whiteheath, Monticello, and on to Decatur. That's going outside of the designated map of the area that includes Savoy, Mahomet, and not so much Rantoul. So that alternative brings in the railroads. Would the railroad like to provide an extension, sell you that 400 feet, and allow you to get to Smith Road, and the Smith Road goes right into the Weaver Park, and that could be the head of the trail? Or you could go through the railroad yards, not likely, but you could go round it to the north. So there may be a negotiation with the railroad company, and that means that railroad companies are a big deal. You might have to deal with 15 attorneys and fairly conservative background. They're not wanting to have bicycle people near to their yards, but there's a possibility there that you can go through the yards on the north and eventually go across University Avenue to Umbox Park, across the Boneyard Creek, part of it owned by the Urbana Park District, then around Busey Woods and on roads that might include Washington into Champaign and under the railroad line and get you across Champaign without you being killed. The other alternative is that you might be able to go take bicycles south to Windsor Road and go across that way and get to Monticello on those sorts of roads. So we're talking about alternatives, and the average citizen can come along, and the average citizen might be the one that would initiate certain ideas. So regular meetings are good. Talking is good. Presentation of the idea is good. So the planners will get together and have a number of trestles that have pictures and maps, and adjacent to each part of the plan, they would have people to explain what the ideas are, and there would be a document where you could sign in and a map that you can work with to suggest that this street might be a good one to use, or it might be one that could be closed. So you're invited to bring your ideas, and then groups like the Regional Planning Office, which has a staff to look at these sorts of things, would put that information together and try and compact it onto a spreadsheet. There is, in this situation, a safety problem. Main Street goes on the south side of the railroad corridor, and it enters Urbana City. That's perhaps what the objective is, rather than to get through the two cities. It's to get into Urbana, which is different from going across. But it gets to be a very narrow main street with a bend just before the present terminus of the railroad bed. So then you have to have safety people, and you have that discussion. Can this be a shared road? It's a well-used road. Can you widen it? Perhaps not, because housing has come up to the edge, and so that would mean you'd have to resume some residential. But gradually, this planning, in some cases, if you're talking about a big rail trail or a road development, this may take 8 years. You have to have a group. In this case, you need to be working with professional planners that, in this case, maybe Farnsworth Company that specializes in putting in urban trails. So part of the effort here is to get enough money to be able to pay the regional planning to do studies, to pay the staff and have facilities, to pay Farnsworth to come up with ideas. And some of those ideas can be wonderful because they've specialized in this task and know the difference between recreation and preservation and railroading. So bringing these people together informally at a meeting where you have the ideas presented, or formally in a presentation, or as a document. And the document for a major highway might be 60 or 70 pages long. It might be accompanied by an inch of maps and charts that tell you where to drain and how deep to drain and how wide a highway might be included into the railroad right-of-way. So this document usually is considered by all parties involved, and it gets to be replete in sometimes if there's an emergency and there's a need and there's a political desire, you can get that plan in a few years. But if it's a regular look at things, looking at long-range planning, it might be 25 years, it might be 5 years, it might be less than that. So we're dealing with people, whether they're elected people, that are specialists in their own fields, engineers or planners or safety people. But those people get to have enough knowledge of each other's objectives that they can talk to each other, even though they cannot use the professional tools that are involved. This can sometimes be a group of citizens arriving and objecting to the possible plan. So you have to deal with that. If we were looking at putting in a railroad line in the middle of an urban area in Chicago, you may have a mountain of signs and citizens screaming at the decision. So then you have to have some diplomacy, and how can you modify? And if you're not being careful enough to do it early, then when the plan is almost set in concrete, you can change a driveway or you can change a small amount, but you really can't change the lot. In our case, we're concerned about vegetation, and part of this trail has been it's been developed in phases. So uh, the the phase that has not been developed yet is about 10 miles of railroad right of way that has vegetation on either side and original soils and original prairie. It's not the world's greatest prairie. It just happens to be the only that we have left, where the state has preserved something like 0.01% of the prairie. So then we have to figure how can we uh, ask for a narrower trail, not 10 feet wide, but perhaps 6 feet wide. Some cases they're 4 feet wide. In some cases where there's a really serious natural areas, it might be just 18 inches wide and it'll go in one direction so you don't have to pass. So that's a question that has not been aired at the moment, but in the background, we need to talk to people about the possibility of shared roads adjacent to the railroad bed where there's good prairie. And this is the sort of thing that has to go through regional planning and QOTS. QOTS has to be generous enough to perhaps think outside their territory. They've mapped out Savoy, Mahomet, Champaign-Urbana. Then they have to think about citizens of this community that are going to use it. Champaign-Urbana likes to go to Vermilion County because it's more rambunctious. It has rivers, and many people from Champaign-Urbana have weekenders in Vermilion County. How do you accommodate the fact that your QOTS organization has a small map frame, but then it is involving your people going outside to use other facilities like at Clinton Lake or Allerton Park or in Vermilion County? Well, you're getting the message more or less that there's eventually a document in the case of the rail trail, the Kickapoo Rail Trail in 1918, I think. You had a 68-page document with maps and charts to go. Now, let's go back to the example of a ring road around Champaign. There was the thought that we should let people go through our city without having to go through Main Street. There's an Olympian Drive to the north, and there was a Windsor Road to the south. Windsor Road had not been instituted. It existed to some extent in Urbana. It followed through from a Philo Road. So how do you think about putting a fairly wide road, a dual highway on Windsor Road? Then you have to involve the University of Illinois that owns the agricultural land through which that Windsor Road would move. So somebody has to institute the idea and move and shake the requests. And so Windsor Road went to First Street, and then there was still a section that had to go further west under a railroad line. Once again, you have to work with railroads, and then through Champaign and further west to Monticello. So these communities around you have to remember, are also bedroom communities. They're going to come into Champaign or through Champaign to go to work situations. Eventually, it was decided to extend Windsor Road from First Street under the railroad line. Now, the railroad had been in planning too. The railroads had been taken over some extent by interstate highways, and to some extent they were regarded as a little antique, and there was a lot of steel and resources there, including railroad ties and ballast that could be used. So there was also a road transportation that obsoleted elevators and small sidings that could take out 15 cars of grain, and that wasn't enough to make an efficient railroad. The railroads were doing well. They had main lines from Los Angeles to Chicago to New York or New Orleans. Those lines were operating well, but often they were dual lines, and could there be one line and you'd skip across and past each other. So we had the situation on Windsor Road where the road was going to be burrowed under the railroad line. But on top, there was a new bridge being built, and it was being built for two railroad lines. But the railroads had decided to remove one of those lines. So we had the situation of a changing dimensions for railroads, and how do you get to burrow under a railroad line? Well, there was already a creek that ran into the Ambra River. It came from Champaign, and it was a wiggly woggly river that would have natural meanders in it. And if you're going to have a straight road, then you can let that river run under the road in pipes, but it's usually convenient to let it go under the road in a right angle manner instead of in an angular manner where you'd have to have a longer element of pipes. Well, it happened. The new bridge, which was designed for two railroads, went in with the railroad. The railroad actually moved east a little bit, and when you move a railroad line, you can never take it back. It's the expense of moving it back again to its original track is huge. So whereas the railroad bed through Champaign on Canadian National, if you were taking a 100-car train, it would go straight south. Well, when you were going to put in a new bridge, you had to put in the bridge a little to the east, and then there's a huge, slow railroad bend that goes around and releases the straight track. It means that if you're going to have a train move at 30 miles an hour or 40 or 50 or 60 or 70, then you're going to have that track engineered so that the cars don't fall over as they go around. So then there's a lot of engineering there, and that's happened. And interesting that it's going to happen further down the line at Curtis Road, not too long from now. So we're dealing with the railroad, and this is where we get involved ourselves. When the road is engineered and QArts has okayed that, there has to be restoration of the landscape around the road. And here you have the headwaters of the Ombra River, which runs basically south to the Wabash, or south and east, into the Ohio or into the Mississippi. So you need to facilitate this creek, but you want it to run parallel to the new highway. That's not natural for water. Water meanders. If you have a rod that you push together from the ends, it will end up in a sigmoid curve, an S-shaped curve. And that's what happens with water. When you put a block on one end and a pressure on the other, you have meanders. So meanders horizontally and meanders up and down, so that you have ponds and waterfalls and a vertical sigmoid curve. So that had to be looked at, and usually you have a floodplain, and that floodplain was replaced by a drainage ditch that was cut with 45-degree angle. So here we have another problem. And when you have a 45-degree angle, and most of the 45-degree is clay, you're going to have to try and plant roadside vegetation on it. It didn't work very well, so very shortly we had the agencies that were working with QArts ask, was there anything you could do with prairie on the side? Because prairie has roots and could help to stabilize this artificial river, as it was given a straight corridor before it ducked under the highway. Well, there were 7 different units involved in the creation of this road. And so the question was, roadside restoration is usually very quick. It involves fescues and brome grass and plants that are designed to germinate in 10 days and give people instant gratification. So the first question was could you plant prairie there? Yes. And how long would it take? Well, give me 10 years. So there was a problem, but no matter what, you couldn't get roadside plants to grow on that ditch. So first thing you would want to have is a little bit of topsoil at least. And that was a problem, because once you put topsoil there, it gets washed away. So there has to be some sort of incorporation of topsoil so that it won't get washed away. So we got the task and were contracted to put in a prairie. And that meant gathering seed from local railroad beds and other preservation sites, and putting in a cover crop The cover crop might be oats or barley or something that grew for 1 or 2 seasons and helped to stabilize the soil. Some of what we would put in could be transplants that would save having to wait several years for the plant to grow. Many of the prairie plants, or most of the prairie plants, are perennial plants, and they germinate slowly, and they put down roots first. So you can have a successful restoration, and you won't really able to really see the plants until 5 years, perhaps. So it's slow. Then, so we established some plants like Indian grass could grow fairly quickly, a Canadian wild rye. Some of the grasses grow faster than the broadleaves, but the broadleaves are interesting. And this was an opportunity to educate the people in they're going to travel. That they're going to travel at high speed because this is a highway with not a lot of interjecting roads or houses or industry. So then there was a need to have a sign. So we put in a sign at right angles so that people from both directions could see it. Later, this whole corridor is when it has been completed and a different funding from different agencies had been concluded. The project is closed out and it is usually assigned to the nearest local responsible body. In this case, it was to the city of Champaign. Well, then you have to deal with the city of Champaign, and the city at that time was very attuned to mowing, as in many cities' cases. There's a feeling that if a car runs off the highway, they should be able to see where they're going, and that isn't always a good thought. If we have a prairie growing, then the car will slow down in the prairie and not necessarily fall into a drainage ditch. But that argument has gone on for years. There's also the feeling that in that prairie there's wildlife that will run out onto the road and distract the driver and cause an accident. So for various reasons, we planted a prairie on the side of the road, right adjacent to the road. And that involved buying Illinois seed. And that's another question. We didn't want to have seed for other states. Illinois seed is scarce and it has to be harvested often by hand. If you go west a little to Kansas, you can have pastures that are also prairies that can be harvested with a combine harvester, and that's cheaper seed. But it's also different seed. It has different species. And so I'm always very sad when I see local restorations on roadsides using Kansas seed. So there's a debate about what we put in, how much it costs. We did get to have a reasonable prairie seeds, and it was blown on with a machine that puts the seed into a barrel of water and forces it onto areas that are not easy to plant with a regular seeder. But we were allowed to add that sort of seed. Unfortunately, the first 10 feet of that planting with original, pretty nice seed and costly was then mown when the project became part of the city of Champaign. It was felt that that area should be mown. There was lots of debate about this, and it's still a problem. Sometimes it will not be mown for a year, and sometimes it will be mown. The sign, which was at an angle so that you could see it from a car going fast along the highway from north, from east and west, got turned around so it was parallel. And it was a nice little planting around it of indicator species. But absolutely no one can see that sign now because it's not in the it's not a traditional advertising sign or billboards that are usually put at an angle so that you will have a visual corridor can see it. Uh, so uh, these are the sort of debates that you have. Uh, you have to be able to burn the prairie every once in a while. And if you're near to the railroad line, you have to have permission to do that. And railroads don't enjoy burns. Although in the past, when they had a steam train and a caboose, then the steam engine sometimes dropped fire, and the caboose had a heater in the back, and sometimes people would actually drop out coals so that the vegetation could be burned, and that kept the right of way open for the railroad line. So you don't know all these things until you get into it. But this stresses the point that uh, debate is very helpful, and over and over I go to conservation meetings. One of the main uh, tenets is please talk to each other. It might be for 10 or 15 years. It may be that the adjacent owner can't stand you having a prairie, but after uh, 15 years of back and forth of discussion, that owner becomes convinced that what you wanted to do was okay. And those citizens often become uh, committed to the project in a manner that's very interesting. So talking is good. Uh, you sometimes end up shouting a little bit. We have a coal mine going in, uh, perhaps in southeast Champaign County and Vermilion County, and there's a lot of resistance to that. So you can go to a meeting, and sometimes those meetings might have 200 people, and a lot of shouting back and forth. But that's part of this, the wonder of doing these things, and we really need leaders who can come and explain to you why you don't want to lift coal up and use it as a non-renewable energy source, and why you don't want it washed with uh, pure aquifer water that will have to go somewhere, like down an old mine curve or something. So you have the opportunity to do that, and sometimes you have people who come in from outside who have an experience with another situation. They may have been in Jamaica or somewhere else where they have had a situation that looks different, but has some innovations that we could use. Uh, and so getting those people involved is good. And we've been talking about using media and visual material that we often put into our programs, and meet with that era when people are uh, utilizing visual material a lot. So uh, to look at our corridor with a satellite feed is very helpful. You can zoom down to the Weaver Park. You can zoom down to the parking lot, to the restroom, and uh, where you're going to send your people on a shared road. Uh, People do get killed on bicycles. So the traveling public is not usually attuned to bicycles. They're more attuned to it in Europe than they are here, where you have long distances and you have a need for uh, road transportation. And uh, so then we're looking for people who can do this sort of coordination work, to become reasonably familiar with this, the area, to become familiar with the citizens, to know their history, to know where they've come from, and perhaps uh, understand their independence. They may have come here as peasants and all of a sudden become landowners and farmers. And so that what is the background? Is it Irish or even Northern Irish or Southern Irish or Scandinavian? I'm reading a book about the connection of Lake Chicago, or the Lake Michigan in Chicago, to the Illinois River. When Joliet came first and was investigating this area, he thought that this would be a must thing to do. And then it gradually happened, and it was actually opened as a canal in 1948, 1848. And I mentioned the two Irish because the Irish people were brought in to create this canal, and it created towns like Lockport and others. Were it was shallow, but there was a waterway, and there were locks, and engineers had to create these locks, and workers had to dig the soil, and water had to be provided. So we look for people who will have a twinkle in their eye about doing this sort of thing, putting in an expressway or keeping a wiggle woggle road. I can think of a road through Atwood to the south of us, which was a wiggle woggle road, and the locals did not want it to be a straight highway. And it took years, but eventually the highway went in straight. But the wiggle woggle road is still there. But I'm watching my clock, and we have about 5 minutes left to for WEFT to encourage you to think about these sorts of programs. WEFT is nearly 40, and it has managed to keep together with community people like yourselves, with debates. At the moment, they've just had a billboard at the corner of Lincoln Avenue and University, two major drags, and there have been virus and Zoom, and people have been able to get together, and there's fundraising, and there are grants with the Arts Council, for instance, and then there are cities, Champaign and Urbana, have facilities to let people see what they're doing. So the city meetings are recorded and with visual. Urbana has a Banner Public Television, which we use here to present this program that I'm talking about now. And uh, so little by little, it doesn't matter how small, your contribution really counts. And I want to encourage that. And so I think I will say this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And please go out there and look at your landscape, look at your relationship to other people, and enjoy life, and exercise that twinkle in your eye.